Well, good morning. How are you guys this morning? Good. It's an honor to get to be with you and to share my story. I've actually been in the area all week. I spoke at Caltech University on Monday and was in San Diego last week. And so I've been looking forward to being with you all, and I'm excited to get to share my story with you this morning. So this will be not the typical sermon of a Sunday morning, but rather I'm just going to share the story that I've been on and the journey I've taken with you guys, because I believe that stories are what really influences hearts and minds. It's how we relate to one another. It's how we bond with one another. It's how we learn and how we grow. And it's what Jesus did. He told stories. And so I'm going to share my story with you this morning. But I'd like to actually open up and start with the words of the ethos that come from my home church in Denver, because it's been a big part of my own journey and my story as I've gone through my coming out process, and it's something that I continue to carry with me. This is how we start every service in our hometown. Married, divorced, and single here. It's one family that mingles here. Conservative or liberal here, we've all got to give a little here. Big or small here, there is room for us all here. Doubt or believe here, we all can receive here. LGBTQ and straight here, there is no hate here. Woman and man here, everyone can here. Whatever your race here, for all of us, grace here. It's in the imitation of the ridiculous love that Almighty God has for each of us and all of us that we choose to live in love without labels. Amen. Well, if you would have asked me 10 years ago what I would be doing today, this would not have been it. I would have probably told you that I expected to be married, which I am. And I probably would have told you that I expected to be in ministry, which I am. But it would not have looked like this. I grew up in a very conservative Christian home. My dad started working at Focus on the Family when I was 3 years old. And for those of you that are not familiar, Focus on the Family was founded by James Dobson in the 80s, and was here in the LA area for a few years, which is when we moved and started working in the very early stages. And then they moved to Colorado Springs in 1991. And my family then transported with them, and that's where they made their headquarters and home. And Focus on the Family is primarily known for teaching family values, for parenting, for promoting healthy marriages, and unfortunately they're also known as one of the most anti-LGBTQ organizations still in existence today. But that was all that I knew growing up. My dad started working there when I was 3, and he still works there to this day. So that was all that I knew. I grew up very much cocooned in this conservative Christian bubble that kept me kind of protected from the outside world. My parents tried to kind of keep me sheltered, and they had very good intentions, and they did very well in raising us. I was homeschooled K through 12. I was involved. People would ask me, well, do you feel socially deprived? And of course I said no, because I was very socially active. I was always involved in groups and in swimming and all these different activities. But I didn't realize how much I actually was being sheltered from the outside world, and how ill-equipped I was to actually walk in and to be able to experience and function as a healthy human being. I was really never exposed to people of diversity of any kind, whether that was racial or religious or disability or certainly LGBTQ. Everybody looked and believed and thought exactly like I did. So I was never really challenged to think for myself or to defend my beliefs or to think outside the box. I just was kind of spoon-fed this theology and took it wholeheartedly without ever questioning it or giving it a second thought. And so when I was growing up, that was just comfortable for me. That was expected. That was what I knew. And I felt kind of this obligation to protect my family's name. My dad works in a pretty prominent position at Focus. And so that burden and that weight started to kind of rest on me as I got older. I didn't feel it so much in my elementary years. You know, in those early years, I was listening to Adventures in Odyssey and acting in Adventures in Odyssey, and it was kind of cool to be the cool kid. But then as I got into my early teens, that pressure started to weigh on me a little more, and I started to feel kind of this responsibility to uphold this family reputation and this kind of family facade. People would look at me and say, "Oh, your family just seems so perfect." And of course, it wasn't perfect. My family did many things very well, but there was also other parts that were really challenging and really difficult. And yet I learned from a very young age to kind of stuff my emotions and hide what I was really feeling and kind of portray this put together face to the outside world. And so I had this responsibility to my family. But when I came out as gay, that responsibility changed. And a few years ago, I was sitting across at the table from Paula Stone Williams, who's a national transgender advocate. She's also from Denver, so I don't know if some of you know her, but she travels and speaks quite a bit as well. And I sat across from her and I told her my story, and I said, I'm thinking of going public with this. What do you think? And if you know Paula, she's quite intense, and she sat there and kind of interrogated me and asked me these questions and just tried to get a feel for my story and where I was headed. And when she got the information she was looking for, she just sat across the table from me and looked me dead in the eye and said, Amber, embedded in your identity is a responsibility to be a voice for change. And that's how I knew it was God and that it was time to tell my story, because it just resonated in my spirit for days and days and days. It was like God speaking through her to me. And so I started writing my story. And that was a journey all in itself to unpack a lifetime of experiences and emotions. But I did it primarily for two audiences. I did it for the LGBTQ person who is wrestling to come out of a conservative faith community, because there are so many of them. I get emails on a daily basis now from people who are coming from a conservative Christian, primarily evangelical background, but not necessarily, who are wrestling in isolation in the closet and are desperate for a beacon of hope. And so the goal was that by sharing my story, I would be able to give them this kind of beacon of hope that would help them navigate their own coming out process. And part of that is to help reduce the risk of suicide rates, because the suicide rates are higher for LGBT people from conservative faith communities. The Trevor Project says that if you have an LGBT youth, they are already 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight peer. But if they are rejected by their family, they are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide, not from the straight peer, but from the peer that's not rejected by their family. So you compare the LGBTQ person that's been rejected by their family to the straight peer, they're 32 times more likely to attempt suicide. So those rates are high, and they need to change. And so that was part of why I've shared my story, because I was so close to suicide myself. The second reason was to help family and friends and pastors and teachers have a story that they can relate to as well, that they can hopefully find themselves within this story, even if they're not LGBTQ themselves, but be able to read and identify with different themes in the story, whether that's focus on the family or Adventures in Odyssey or homeschooling or purity culture, and be able to identify not as this political hot debate that we often see in the news, but make it a real story that they can relate to. And if they can find themselves within this story, maybe we can create some conversations for change of how to better include people in our churches and in our experiences. I grew up in the heart of the purity culture, which said that true love waits and you save sex for marriage. And so that was a big part of my upbringing, really from the very beginning. That was always expected of me. That marriage was, of course, between a man and a woman. That was never even questioned. But that you would also save sex for marriage. And so at the age of 13, I signed a purity covenant. And on the dotted line, I had all my friends and family come for this big, coming of age ceremony that took me into the beginning of womanhood. And in front of all my family and friends, signed this covenant that I would save sex for marriage. And my dad put this purity ring on my finger that had a heart and a key and a cross that symbolized that God would hold the key to my heart until I someday gave it to my husband. And I was to wear that ring on my wedding finger until the day I got married, and then exchange it for my wedding vow and my wedding ring. And that was really, that was expected of me, but I also never questioned it because it was just what you did. That was what you did to honor God. It was what you did to please God, and I wanted to please God with my heart and my life. I had a very passionate heart for God from a very young age, and that was something I never questioned. I wanted to please God. I wanted to be a good role model, so I never even thought about it or questioned it. But I didn't realize until I got older how much being a part of the purity culture made it difficult to discern my sexual orientation earlier on in life. Because I was homeschooled and primarily in Christian circles and primarily in female circles, I really didn't have a lot of male friends growing up. There were primarily female friends, which did not work out in my parents' favor in the long run. But so I really didn't have a lot of male friends growing up, and that really hindered me from being able to discover my sexual orientation earlier on in life, because I never dated at all. I never had the experience of dating or of being in public school and talking with my friends and having these experiences and shared commonality. I never got those experiences. And so I really walked blindly, just thinking, if I just wait and I please God with my life and I follow his will, someday my knight in shining armor is going to come running down the path on a white horse, and we'll fall in love and get married and all will be well. But that's not what happened. Well, it did, but not like that. So it wasn't until in my early 20s when I fell in love with my female roommate that I started to really question my sexual orientation. And really, I knew that I was different. I always wrestled with something. I could never quite pinpoint it. I never quite knew what it was. I never quite knew why, but I just always wrestled. I never quite fit in. And part of that was because of the educational track I was on. I fast-tracked through school, so I graduated high school at 16. I had my college degree at 18. Which kind of put me at the oddball out no matter where I was, because I was too young to be able to really fit in with the college crowd, but then I didn't really fit in with high school either because I was taking college courses, so I kind of felt like I was just always this misfit that never quite fit anywhere. But there was something more, there was something deeper, and I just didn't know what it was. I didn't have the experience, I didn't have the exposure or the language to put with it. But I wrestled a lot with depression and anxiety and just this inner turmoil that I could never quite pinpoint. So when I fell in love with my female roommate in my early 20s, I did not know what to do. It was just a slap upside the head. It was so unexpected and so foreign, and I felt so divided because it caught me so off guard. I had never had any experience, and you certainly weren't supposed to, if anything, it was supposed to be with a man, not a woman. And I felt so divided inside and so at war and at conflict. And so I actually want to read an excerpt that comes from the prologue of the book, because it describes how I was feeling in that moment, where you've got this faith that you've been raised with, and that I had loved God with all my heart. I wanted to please God more than anything. And yet this new thing was rising up inside of me, and I didn't know what to do with it, and I didn't know how to resolve it, and I didn't know where it was coming from. And so this excerpt from the beginning of the prologue really describes how I was feeling in that moment. That realization caused me to feel disjointed, like I didn't fit in anywhere. It was as if half of me belonged in one world and half of me in another. Both worlds coexisted in my heart, yet refused to cohabitate in real life. I stood at a crossroads. I refused to lie or be a hypocrite, but I knew that if my secret were found out in church, I would no longer be allowed to serve in ministry. Torn and conflicted, I engaged in a mental war day and night, a war I couldn't escape because it raged inside of me. This internal war was so brutal, it produced external scars. Self-injury was the only way I knew to survive. Eventually, I began to wonder if the struggle was worth it. I wondered if it would be better to be dead. And when you're taught to hate this group of people, we would never say that, but you love them from a distance. You don't actually associate with anybody of the LGBT community, and it's clearly implied that they are far from God's will. and that they are, their souls are in jeopardy of going to hell, and they have, they're an abomination, and all the typical things that you hear is what I was taught growing up. So when you're taught to hate that group of people, but then that group of people becomes you, then you start to hate yourself. And so I turned that turmoil inward and started on this downward spiral of struggling with depression and anxiety, which led to self-loathing and self-hatred and self-injury, and eventually to suicidal ideations. Because I didn't know what to do. These were two worlds that could not coexist. And so I got to the point where I had to look it in the face. It was my greatest fear, but I had to face it head on because I knew that if I didn't, it was going to be the thing that killed me. And so I started on this journey, and I really didn't know how to start or where. There really wasn't much available as far as resources go like there are today. We've got a number of excellent resources available now that people have written in the last few years to help people reconcile their theology and their faith with their sexuality. But when I was wrestling with coming out, there wasn't much available. And so I didn't really even know where to start. And I wanted to really find the truth. I wanted to know what it really said. I didn't want to water down the scripture to justify my way of life like people told me I was doing. I really wanted to know. And I was just as terrified that God would say it was okay to be gay as to hear that God was not okay with me being gay, because I knew that either way my life was going to drastically change. And so I started out on this journey. And for me, that looked like it happened in several different ways. One thing was that I put myself in counseling because I felt like it was important to start to unpack this lifetime of emotions, because emotions were never really expressed in our household in a healthy way. At least not the full spectrum of emotion. Emotions like happy and excited and blessed were all acceptable emotions in our household. Oh, you're familiar with that one. Yes. Everything is to be a blessing to others. But emotions of disappointment or anger or sadness were not so well received. And so I learned from a very young age to suppress what I felt and wear a happy smile and cover up what was really going on inside. But then by the time I hit my teen years, I had so many years of emotion stuffed inside that it started to come out in other ways. And so certainly that built throughout my teens and compacted and compounded and got worse. And so I had been in counseling a number of times, but usually with a Christian therapist. You know, having any kind of struggle is already taboo enough because that means you don't have enough faith. But then to go to counseling, you know, there's kind of a hierarchy. So if you hit one of these things somewhere, you're eventually going to go to counseling because you want to resolve that so that you can kind of put your mask back on and have it all together. And so being gay was certainly one of those taboo things. You just go to counseling because that's the level of hierarchy is you've gotten up there. So you're kind of maxing out at the top. There's not much farther you can go. So I decided to put myself in counseling, and I made sure that I found a licensed counselor who was not just a Christian therapist, but would support my belief system and my journey of faith, but also support me being able to try and navigate where I stood with my sexual orientation. And it was one of the most helpful things I had ever done because I had a safe space to be able to come and start unpacking a lifetime of emotions that I really didn't even know how to label. They were so jumbled up inside of me that I didn't even know how to express emotion in a healthy way. I didn't even know how to communicate what I was really feeling. I was just so overwhelmed by it. So to be able to start kind of naming and labeling emotions was so very, very helpful for me. I also began to date and try and have some experience with dating because I felt like, well, I'm either going to find it in dating or I'm going to find it in counseling. And if I don't find it in one, I'll find it in the other. And somehow we'll figure this road out together. And so I did some dating. And then I tried to also figure out where I stood, what I really believed about what the Bible said on this issue of same-sex marriage. Because so much of my upbringing had been just spoon-fed to me, and I just accepted everything that was taught as these authorities from God that had it all figured out, and never really questioned or dug deep for myself. So I did my best to dig deep, to try and figure out what I believed for myself. And I kind of had to silence the voices around me for a time because I knew everybody was going to have their own opinion. And I really wanted to hear God for myself. And so I did my best to kind of use the resources that were available to figure out the theology piece of what the Bible really said. And I was able to do that to a pretty good degree, but I also needed not only just kind of this mental shift, but I also needed a heart shift to be able to see that it was really possible for me to be able to live a happy, fulfilling life as a gay Christian woman. And I didn't know that I could. That was something that was so foreign to me. It was navigating uncharted waters for sure. And so I finally kind of reached this end's rope where I just didn't know what else to do. And I sat down at my computer one day and just Googled gay Christian churches. And as many of you probably have, because that's all you know to do. And so I sat down and did that. And the first thing that popped up was this church in Denver, Colorado. And I was still living in Colorado Springs at the time, but I decided to take a risk and email this pastor. And I just poured my heart out to him, and I told him the journey I had been on, and I told him what had happened. And I didn't really expect to get a response. I grew up in a 14,000 person mega church where you email the pastor, you never hear anything, you know. And if you do, it goes to this secretary who goes to this secretary who then gives you some scripted response, or, oh, we don't want to deal with that, so we're just going to pass it off. So I didn't think I'd ever hear anything back. But I kid you not, 2 hours went by before I got the most heartfelt response from this pastor himself. And he said, please come visit. I will set somebody up to meet with you. I will set somebody up to take you to lunch and show you around. And he did. And so I drove from Colorado Springs to Denver, and I didn't know what I was going to find when I got there because I had never seen another gay Christian person before. I didn't know what to expect when I walked through those doors. But when I walked through them, I was surrounded by people like me. There were no rainbow flags in the foyers, or people making out, or drag queens hanging out. Like, they were just normal people. And my heart just felt so at home as I sat and heard the words of these ethos read for the first time. And I just sat and cried because I finally felt safe for the first time. I finally felt like I belonged, like I could bring all of me and I didn't have to divide me in half. And I didn't have to compartmentalize who I was. And that day, so much changed for me because I found people that not only loved God, but were so in love with their same-sex partner or spouse and had been together for 20, 25, 30 years. And they could talk about them both in the same context without any conflict in between. And it was just the most beautiful thing that I had ever seen. And so a lot changed for me that day. And I actually ended up commuting back and forth from Colorado Springs to Denver every Sunday for 6 months, trying to build some support system, trying to build some help, and some people around me that could embrace me. And for me, that really gave me the heart shift that I needed to be able to embrace who I was, not only theologically, but also just to be able to see that I could live a happy, fulfilling life. And so once I kind of had all the pieces that lined up for me, I knew I was going to have to come out to my family. And there was just no, like, we were so close. You know, some people they live on one coast and their family lives on the other coast and they can get away with it because they only see each other once a year and it's not a big deal. That would never work for my family. We all lived within like a mile of each other and we saw each other all the time and we talked every day and we were just super close on every level. And so I knew I was going to have to tell them the truth. It was exhausting to try and live this double life where you had to filter what you said all the time and wonder who was going to find out and were you going to slip up and say something before you were ready. And I was very methodical in the way I did it, you know, as far as coming out to my family. And I had, you know, a lot of things set in place to make sure that they heard it from me and not from somebody else. But I knew that I was going to have to sit them down and tell them. And I didn't know what their reaction was going to be. And I knew they wouldn't embrace me. I knew it wasn't going to be like, yay, that's great, we're so happy for you. But I didn't think that it would be the extreme of them totally cutting me out either. I thought it would be kind of somewhere in the middle. I knew it could cost me everything, but I wasn't prepared for the fact that it actually would. And I brought my family in one day, and I had them all sit down, and I told them the journey that I'd been on. And I told them the journey that I had been on with God, because I knew that was going to be their biggest fear, was where had I taken this with God, and what was my relationship with God like. So I tried hard to tell them about the relationship that I had and the journey that I had taken with God. But I don't think they heard a word that I said. They glazed over like deer in the headlights, and I think they knew what was coming as I ramped up to telling them that I was gay. And once I did, those words just kind of hung in the air as I waited for the response. And it was by far the most vulnerable that I've ever felt in my life. And my dad just looked at me and he said, "I have nothing to say to you right now." And he got up and walked out the door. And I didn't hear from them for 3 weeks, which in my family was like forever because we talked every day. And when I did, I had hoped that they would have some time to kind of process and try to understand where I was coming from. But instead, it was much worse. They said, "We feel like you've died." And they compared me to murderers and pedophiles and bestiality, and said, "How dare you do this to our family? You're so selfish to do what makes you happy and not think about how this would impact our family." Of course, that was all I had thought about for months leading up to it, was how this was going to impact our family and change the dynamics that we had. But in their minds, I had turned my back on God and everything they'd ever taught me. And they actually said, "I'd rather you completely turn your back on God and be gay than be gay and pretend that everything between you and God is okay." And so the second excerpt that I want to read to you comes from the end of that conversation, which is one of the toughest conversations that we had. And this comes as I'm getting ready to leave. Finally, after I'd been thoroughly reprimanded and ostracized, the conversation wrapped up. But as I went to leave, there was one final jab to my heart that made all of this very real. As I went to walk out the door, my dad asked for the key to their house back. My childhood home that I'd grown up in from the age of 7, the door that had always been open to me to come by whenever I needed, was now locked, and I was left out in the cold. I was now an outsider, no longer welcome as part of the family. He said he no longer trusted me to have open access to their home. Baffled, I removed the key from my keychain and handed it to him. I think he tried to soften the blow by saying, "I love you," before closing the door, but I don't remember for sure. All I could feel was the hurt, the pain, and the rejection from those I cared about the most. I never expected my parents to be accepting or approve of the fact that I was gay, but for the first time in my adult life, I took the risk of completely trusting in their love for me as parents, yet was met with rejection. In my hour of greatest need, my family abandoned me. Arriving home, I opened my journal and in utter heartbreak, wrote 10 of the most painful words of my life. My worst fear has come true. I've become an orphan. And that was one of the hardest days. I'd like to say that it got better and easier over time, but that was just the beginning of it. In the following months, there were times where they slowly shunned me with their words and times that they did it with passive-aggressive behavior. But they slowly just kept pushing me further and further to the outside, telling me that I no longer belonged. And I really didn't know what I was going to do because I was losing everything. My whole life was just falling apart. And I actually ended up picking up and moving to Denver because it was the only way I knew to survive. I had lived in Colorado Springs all my life. Everybody knew me. Everybody knew my family. I felt like I was always walking on eggshells, looking over my shoulder. And so I picked up and moved. And it was by far the best decision I could have made. It was hard because I lost not only my family, but all of my extended family cut me off. I lost the majority of my friends. I left the home church I'd known for 14 years, and I moved away from the only hometown that I'd ever known. And so I literally was having to start again from nothing. And yet it was such a healing place to be at the same time, because I was able to really start again and start building supportive community around me for the first time, start to be able to live authentically for the first time. So even as I went through this interesting dynamic of, we had a couple years of a lot of tension where my parents kept hoping I would change, hoping that things would get better. And so there was a lot of tension there. And so I was simultaneously losing everything and yet feeling more peace and more joy than I'd ever felt. So it was this really interesting combination. I was single when I came out, and then met Clara, who is now my wife, about a year later. And she's not here today. This is one of the only events that she's not been able to be at, but she had to get back to work. But we've been married about 4 years now. And so during the whole time when we were dating and getting to know one another, and then we got engaged, this whole time was this tension with my family of hoping that I was going to come around. They'd even say, the door is always open if you ever want to come back to Jesus and come back to us. And that's what they were hoping for. But when I then got married, I think that hope for them was gone, and they just cut me off completely. And so I haven't had any contact with them in about 4 years. And while that's been incredibly hard, and I continue to grieve that loss, obviously, I still wouldn't trade where I am today for anything. I feel more at peace. I feel more at home in my own skin. I feel more free than I've ever felt. The people I've met, nobody can replace your family, but the people that I've met have brought so much life and such richness and depth to me. It's the people I've longed to meet all of my life. I always felt like I was living in this Barbie doll world where nobody was real with each other, and I finally got to meet people that were real and authentic, and it's just been so rich and beautiful. And so that's kind of where I've been able to springboard then and share my story with others, because being in community with people, and as we share stories, we can help one another along each of our journeys. And it's not easy. It's not to say that all the pain is gone and everything is happy, and there's still pain there. But I love the life that my wife and I are creating together. I love the journey that we're on. I love the traditions that we're starting to build into our own family. Holidays have always been hard for me, but this past Christmas felt like the first time that we kind of were anchored in our own family, and it just felt really good, and it felt home without this emptiness there. And so it takes time. It takes time to build all that up. But it's been a beautiful journey, even when it's painful. And I wouldn't trade it. I really wouldn't, even though it's cost me so much. It's just been so rewarding in so many ways. It's brought my faith so much deeper in so many ways. The diversity that I've seen in God, the depth that I've seen in God, the love that I've seen in God. So much of my previous world felt wrapped up in this box of certainty. And everything was right or wrong, black and white. I had all the answers. But what I realized was that if you have all the answers, what do you need faith for? And where I live now is so much more dependent on faith, so much more dependent on who God really is and what he really says. And that's where I try to live out of it. It used to scare me to kind of live in this place of doubt and wondering and not having all the answers. But now I find it very comforting and very freeing to be able to say, I don't know all the answers, and that's okay. But that I'm growing and I'm living out of that faith on a daily basis. I'd like to ask you to close your eyes, if you don't mind. I know this is quite a journey. I know the topics are hard. I know some of it can be triggering for some people. But just take a deep breath. And let's let God meet us where we're at. I'm going to share with you one of my favorite quotes of all time by Marianne Williamson. And as I do, just let it sink into your soul. If it helps, you can open up your hands. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking back so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine, as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. As we move into a time of communion, I want you to reflect on God's love for you. This love that says that you are always enough. You don't have to measure up. You don't have to prove anything. God loves you right where you are. All you have to do is open up to him. On the night that Jesus shared a meal with his friends, he said, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember this as a token of my love." And the same with the cup, his love poured out for you. As we receive communion today, I invite you to receive his love. Exactly as you are, exactly who you are, exactly where you are, into your hearts. So you can ask me pretty much anything. I'm a pretty open book, so feel free to be the first one. Sure.
So when people ask you to justify same-sex relationships scripturally, theologically, do you even answer that question anymore? And if so, how do you do it? Like, how do you justify it?
So when I'm asked to justify same-sex relationships, do I? The answer is not usually. There's so many great resources to point people towards at this point. And for me, if they're hell-bent on what they believe already, nothing I say is going to change that. So there's no use in getting a debate over scripture. I don't see any use for that. However, if they're really wanting to search, they need to do that work for themselves, in my opinion. They need to go read, they need to go study, they need to go figure it out. Because it's pretty, there's different books will give you different levels of academic research, but there's quite a bit on that research. And so it's something I feel like they need to go kind of figure out for themselves, research, and kind of work through in their own personal relationship with God. So I generally don't go into a scriptural debate with people who ask me. I will usually point them to the resources available. Oh. Somewhere over here? Yes.
So I want to, this is more of a, I don't know how involved you still are with keeping up with the culture of like focus on the family and stuff, because I remember personally when I was younger, as part of an evangelical culture, I led like book studies about like lust and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So Joshua Harris type of the whole purity culture thing. So I guess my question is, because this was a tension back then, and focus on the family started to really confuse me, because I remember I was part of a male, what I'm sure evangelical dudes will remember, the accountability groups, where it's like, all right, how many times do you masturbate this week? Just make sure it's fewer than last week. And, go from there. So anyways, the thing, there was this book I remember going through called Not Even a Hint by Joshua Harris. But I remember around the same time, Focus on the Family apparently came out as being okay with masturbation. And it was like, I was like, oh, well, that seems really weird of them to do, especially with being, anti-LGBT and everything. So I was kind of wondering twofold. part of that question too is, do you know where they actually stand on that? Are you familiar with that? And also, are they actively pursuing people, LGBT people, to get involved with conversion therapy? Because I know a lot of that started to kind of crumble. A lot of those programs started to crumble a few years ago. I just wondered if you knew the current state of that.
That's a good question. I can't say that I know where Focus on the Family stands on masturbation. I haven't done any research on that, but I should. That'd be interesting to know. Because really, it all ties together, right? I mean, masturbation and pornography and same-sex, they lump it all together as this whole big, huge, sinful genre. So it would be interesting to see if they, have kind of moved stance. I don't even know, I know within Focus on the Family, I think, Jim Daly's president now. James Dobson is still associated with Focus in many people's minds, but he's actually not. There's been a tie that's been cut, so he's actually not affiliated with Focus anymore. And I think Jim Daly is actually a little more open to having some of the conversations. People like Justin Lee and Matthew Vines have actually gone in and having conversations with him. But the feedback I hear is that he is more responsive than the board, and the board is not wanting to move or budge. And so I think as far as conversion therapy, I know Exodus, International has been shut down, which was the primary conversion therapy organization. But I think that if you get in and you do the research, they still approve of conversion therapy, unfortunately, which is so unfortunate on so many levels, but I believe that they do still. I don't know that they would actively promote it, but they do still. Even when your child comes out, they talk about, well, you have to grieve this because this is not what you expected for your child, and they make it such a negative thing as opposed to a positive thing that could be celebrated. So I think there's still a lot of negativity and harm coming out of it, unfortunately. In fact, somebody had just contacted me recently about something to do with conversion therapy in Colorado Springs, and there was a big article on it, and they were, I think, going to reach out for a comment from me for the Gazette because they were seeing how much it was still impacting. Focus on the Family's got a pretty strong hold in Colorado Springs and around the world, and so I think they've still have a lot of influence when it comes to things like conversion therapy and the voice on that. Yeah, Emily. Yeah.
Was that something that your family tried to encourage, or it seems like you kind of I don't know if this was intentional, but it seems like you kind of steeled up, getting ready to be nope, this is it.
Yeah, I kind of did, and they kind of knew that. So I didn't really give them the option. They said, they when I told them I was pretty firm in my decision because I knew that if I showed any room for wavering, they were going to try and take advantage of that. And so they saw that and they knew that, and they're like, well, we wish you would have come to us sooner because then we could have helped you. And even if you had still ended up the same, at least we would have known we could have done everything we could to make you change, And they even said, we would love to have taken you to Love One Out, which was the, conversion therapy at Focus. And we would love to have done this stuff with you. So I know that they wanted to, but I just really didn't give them any space for that. And we tried to get into this place where we could have this conversation or agree to disagree. And in their mind, they couldn't even do that. They couldn't even agree to disagree because in their mind, that was the same thing as condoning. And it took me a long time to realize that, so they already believe that I'm going to hell, that I've put my soul in jeopardy of going to hell because I've turned my back on God in their minds. But it took me a while to figure out that they think that by agreeing to disagree and therefore condoning, that they are then putting their souls in jeopardy of going to hell just by associating with me, who is active in that lifestyle. So that was, it took me a while to figure out why they wouldn't get in this kind of common space of let's just agree to disagree and still have a family and, and do life together. But it finally dawned on me that that was why. And I think that's really what they believe in their minds, is that it then puts their soul at jeopardy of going to hell. So, yes?
I assume that your faith at present is not just everything you believed when you were 16, except for it's okay to be gay. But I'm curious about how, using that last story about your parents believing that you're going to hell and they will go to hell, just talking to you, how your view of God
So how has my faith kind of evolved through the process? It's definitely gone through a deconstruction, because I think there's been a lot of theology that I was taught that that I would no longer say that I believe. But it's also gone through, that we're reconstructing it. And I find that, I think that will be a lifelong journey. It's not something that's just going to happen overnight. 30 years of bad theology, and not necessarily that all of it was bad, but some of these views of that God is an angry God, or God is to be feared, or God is to be God hates you because you're gay, or those kind of things. Those can take a long time to undo, and so I think I'm trying to take the good pieces with me as I move forward. But it's definitely been trying to kind of sift through. Okay, what do I still hold on to and value, and what do I let go of, and how do I kind of deconstruct that and reconstruct it into something that in reality I think is a better reflection of who Christ really is, as opposed to a religion, more of who I believe Jesus to be. And that I think will continue for life. And I'm okay with that, because that means I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly growing, I'm constantly building up who I am and what I believe. But I think it's a lifelong journey. So, yes, in the back, and then the gentleman right in front.
Mine's kind of on a personal nature, so feel free to answer. Do you have any siblings, and if so, what was in their process of it? And then, for a man who's so involved in the evangelical movement and who has a Savior that believes in unconditional love, how do your parents and how do other Christian parents justify the shunning, the throwing them out, in some of our younger youth, the throwing them out of the house? Totally, you're not an entity to them anymore. How do they justify that in their faith?
Yeah. So I do have one younger brother. He's about 3.5 years younger than I am. And I actually came out to him the night before I came out to my parents. We had a conversation over dinner, and he said, I don't understand, and I'm sure I'll have some questions, but it certainly isn't something I would disown you over. So he seemed okay at first. And then he came again the next day when I told my parents. And I don't know what happened when they all walked out that day, but I just never heard from him again. And so there was, some tension in there where my family and I were trying to figure things out. And we did have a conversation at one point in the middle of that. But then, there was a lot of silence. It went from my family and I talking all the time to just very sparingly ever having a conversation. And when you did, it was very tense and awkward. But then about 2 years ago, out of the blue, he called me up on my birthday. And I hadn't heard from him in a long time. And he just called me up and said, I just want to have a relationship with my sister. And he had just had his first baby girl. I didn't even know they were pregnant. She was already 2 months old. And said, I want a relationship with my sister. I'd like to meet Clara. And so I felt like, okay, well, maybe he's trying, to kind of bridge the gap. So I sent him a baby gift, and the holidays came, and I sent him a Christmas gift. Never heard from him again, and never have. So I think he feels caught in the middle. He's very, very close with my dad. And I don't think that he wants to jeopardize that. I think he feels stuck. So that's on the sibling way. On the, how do they justify that? They say a lot that God's love is unconditional, but you wonder if they really believe it. I think so much of what my parents believe is based on a theology of fear, and I don't think they even realize it. There's so much fear at the root of everything. Fear of what other people are going to think, fear of reputation, fear of going to hell, fear of disappointment, fear of sin, fear. There's just so much fear. And like I said, I think they're completely oblivious to that. But that was one of the hardest things for me to grapple with, was to realize that my parents' love actually came with strings attached. They loved me if I did A, B, and C, but if I did this, then they didn't love me anymore. And so that was a hard thing for me to grapple with. So I think they compartmentalize a lot, and that's how they somehow justify it, is they compartmentalize what they believe. And so much with my family is based on appearances and reputation, unfortunately. And so what this looks like to other people, what it looks like to the family, what it looks like for my dad's job. He would even tell me, I'm so embarrassed by you because of all the fans that follow my work, and to have a daughter, it's just embarrassing to me. So I think so much, unfortunately for them, is based on appearances. Yes, right in front here.
I think you kind of just answered this, but I don't want to ask anyway. In your experience with their sort of anti-LGBT plus theology and everything, like in your conversation with your parents and everything, how much of that do you feel was rooted in fear of hell or fear of their own God?
How much of our conversation was rooted in fear of hell? Most of it. I think the majority of it comes out of a fear of hell, fear of what this does to what it does to their belief system. Because you put a crack in their belief system and suddenly they think everything is going to crumble, and then they have nothing left, and that is terrifying. And I understand that because I was there myself, where I had to face, okay, if I'm wrong about this, what else am I wrong about? And that's an overwhelming thing to have to confront. So I think the majority of it is based in some kind of fear, whether it's fear of going to hell, fear of being wrong. My parents have a hard time, swallowing pride and admitting that they're wrong. And I think that's something they may never be able to do, based on, and somebody asked me, do I think after my dad retires in a year or two if that will change? And I don't know. I don't know if that will continue to still influence the way that they think and feel and do life, because they really believe that they are right. There's no room for error. It is black and white. And so I don't know if once he retires, if that will make a difference or not. I really don't know. Yeah, Emily.
I'm just this is part comment, part question, but because I hadn't really had an opportunity to read your book yet or anything, but one of the things that correct me if I'm wrong, is Cantorna is your married name, correct?
Yes, Cantorna is my married name.
But you've never actually identified who your
No, I have
dad
not.
is, right? And that's, I feel like that's kind of commendable in some sense that you're not trying to embarrass or shame him for what he does. Is that rooted in kind of leaving that door open for the future, or?
So the question is, have I named my father? And I have not. That's been intentional. Cantorna is my married name, so people can figure it out if they want to. It's not hard, but I have never exposed or announced my dad's name or his position at Focus. He does still work there, and part of that, I think, because somebody was like, well, aren't you still then protecting your family because you're not exposing who they are? But it's more than that. It's about taking the high road. It's about being the bigger person. My publishers they really wanted me to just nail Focus to the wall and throw my parents under the bus and just book sales, yes. And I said, I can't do that. I said, if I do that and I come across bitter or like I've got an axe to grind, nobody's going to listen to me, and I'm going to repel the very people who need to hear this message the most. And so I've been very careful to walk this fine line of being very honest about my experiences and how bad theology has influenced me and my family, because in some ways they're victims of bad theology themselves, right? So not that justifies their behaviors, but it does explain some of them. And so I've been careful to be honest about the way that that's influenced me and impacted our family. But I also try to do it in a way that's respectful and compassionate, so that people can, who may not otherwise pick up the book, would pick it up and read it and identify with these themes, and then hopefully be drawn in to the story and realize these are real people. These are real families that are being torn apart, not held together. I never dreamed that my dad's position at Focus would be the thing that tore my family apart rather than bonded us together. But that's what happened. And so, if they can identify with it being a real person, then hopefully they can rethink the way that they do things. And so it's been intentional that I haven't said that for that reason, is to hopefully impact people because of that.